When the COVID crisis is all said and done, we probably won't be able to look back on it and see the kind of visual devastation that we usually see in the event of a natural disaster, such as an earthquake or a wildfire. But make no mistake, this is a disaster. And joining us today to talk about how they have gotten through similar disasters, maybe not the pandemic kind of disaster, but certainly natural disasters, are Jim Anderson of Florida Rock and Tank Lines, Evan and Josh Schmidt of Liquid Trucking, and Brian Filko from Jetco. Jim, let's jump right in on some of those experiences. Hurricane Michael, a Cat 5 hurricane that pretty much made a beeline for your front door. What did that do to some of your Florida-based operations?
By the time it made landfall, right in the Panama City, Mexico Beach area, it was up to a Cat 5. And we actually have a terminal based in Panama City. So we were all hands on deck, going into the storm, preparing for it, and then, doing everything that we could to protect, our employees and our equipment facilities and hoping for the best.
Nebraska, and for the proximity of you guys, had a fairly generational flood about a year or so ago, right?
This property, while it's near the river, yes, it's never been wet in the last 100 years plus of recorded history. So you don't ever dream of this kind of thing happen to you. You always think a bad accident is going to happen to us. We've been preparing in all the wrong places. So I guess it just goes to show you, you can be as prepared as you want, but, when disaster strikes, it can literally be anything. And kind of like this pandemic we're going through now, it's, no one in their wildest dreams thought that this is how we're going to operate.
Brian, this is not your first go around with some sort of business disruption that really was out of you guys' control. You had to get through Hurricane Harvey, which was a little unique in that you had to overcome both the hurricane damage and all that flooding. So talk to us a little bit about how you managed to get through all that.
I think that when you're leading through a crisis, you have to have one foot firmly planted in the crisis, and you have to be sure that you're making decisions that are needed to get through the crisis, but you've also got to have the other foot planted in tomorrow. So as we went through Harvey, we looked not only at how we were going to survive, but how we were going to thrive. And we're going through the same thing now with COVID-19. It's a very painful process for all of us, everybody in the country, the world. But we're also looking at what are we learning and how are we going to take those learnings and bring them forward to be stronger and better coming out of this. The most important thing to understand is that the outcomes are generally tied to your leadership ability. The first thing that I learned in Harvey is I couldn't lead anybody if I wasn't ready. And I don't think there's any one of us out there who don't have concerns about this, whether personal, whether it's our family, whether it's the health of our business, the security of our jobs. I mean, there are fears. Let's be real. We're in uncharted territory. So we've got to be sure that we have addressed our fears, that we've been honest with ourselves so that we're in a position to lead.
We saw the news footage, and that area was just completely decimated. It was really incredible. How do you get back on your feet?
Well, it really, for us, it starts with getting in touch with all of our employees to check on their safety, their well-being, how did they fare through the storm, seeing if they have any needs that we can help them with. That initial employee assessment is critical. And then from there, you work yourself out to your facility. What are your operational capabilities at that point? Do you have a facility that you can even use to operate out of? Do you have power? Do you have damage to your equipment? There's that initial assessment, and then having your plan in place to support any needs that you have, so you can quickly get the personnel and support to that area to help get that terminal back up and going when it's safe to do so.
Talk a little bit about your plan, maybe your business continuity plans. Hurricanes are not new to your part of the world, so I imagine you have a lot of severe weather baked into that plan. So, how do you develop it? What goes into it?
Well, over the years, we have worked to have a standardized plan, which we work on in May, kind of dust it off, if you will, from the prior year to review it both as a company-wide review and then at each individual terminal. And so with doing that, you're able to double check, make sure that everything that needs to be thought about has been considered. If you have equipment and such that needs to be checked, such as generators, that's part of your plan prior to the storm arriving. And this all takes place in May and June as we come into hurricane season.
Give us some a little of the details. I mean, I guess you've got maybe a little bit of warning, but probably not a lot to really prepare for it. So when you walk in, everything's flooded out. What do you do? What's step one?
Luckily, we have a team of great employees, lots of guys that can do lots of different things. So we were running equipment out of here as quickly as we could. We had about 12 hours from the time we just started getting all the equipment out to the time the road became impassable. And so we did have about 50 pieces of equipment trapped in here, but we were able to get most of it out so we could keep most of our fleet running. We had all of our dispatchers over dispatching. We'd called them the night before and said, hey, be here by 5 a.m. And they were. So we got everybody inside and we dispatched normally, although we had water, right up to the doors of the buildings by Friday evening. We sent out an email to all of our customers and all of our drivers, all of their Qualcomms, and said, hey, as of right now, we're closed. And here's a list of cell phone numbers you can reach us at. We'll do the best we can with getting your loads there. Just understand that we're underwater. Evan and I went on a hunt, kind of put a cry out for help through social media to say, hey, we're in desperate need of office space. Greg Young, Chevrolet, and Chrysler offered us one of their buildings where they had moved in up on the highway. And they weren't using it, but it had been used in the last couple of months, so it had everything we needed. Yeah. Power, internet, phones, enough space to pack everybody in there. And so we decided to move up there, I think by 5:30 Saturday afternoon is when we had everything set up, working, ready to go. And by Monday morning, we were rolling. As normal as we could be. We were dispatching. And I guess the next thing is okay, now we're dispatching, we've got our communications, how are we going to get payroll done? So it's just one thing at a time. It's payroll. Now it's how can we collect our bills? And you just put one foot in front of the other and do the best you can in a situation like that.
What about employee buy-in when it comes to community support? I mean, these are scary times. You've got people worried about being infected. Now they might be homeschooling their kids or dealing with the job loss from a spouse. And how do you communicate that message when employees themselves may have so much personal drama and a lot of upheaval going on in their lives?
In times of crisis, it's impossible to over-communicate. You need to communicate with your employees and their families. You've got to tell them, what are we doing to get through the crisis? You've got to be a resource. It's critical that leaders adapt. In the case of Harvey, our team raised money internally, and we used that money to help employees that had a short-term need. So maybe they weren't able to get FEMA money that fast. Maybe they weren't able to find a short-term apartment if their home flooded out. So that money was used to pay for a couple nights of hotel, meals, short-term assistance to our employees. And even though the money wasn't big, like the trillions of dollars the government is spending right now, that little bit helped because it showed we cared within the best of our ability. A good plan violently executed right now is far better than a perfect plan executed next week. I see too many people get paralyzed by a crisis. and they'll paralyze themselves through too much analysis. You take the data that you've got, you take the situation you've got, you make the best decisions you can, you execute. And you know what? If things weren't quite right, you do a course correction tomorrow or next week. But you don't wait to act until you get everything right, because the facts are changing. The dynamics are changing too fast in this market to think you can do that. It's much better to do the best you can today, take some action, and then do a course correction if you need to. The crisis clearly changes what we do. Our priority list changes. Everything that made sense 2 months ago is completely rearranged and doesn't make sense today. But this is the time to enhance your values. It's time to lead by your values. It's important to be sure that the crisis today doesn't cause us to take short-term, to make short-term decisions that compromise our values. I'll give you an example. As you know, the federal government has waived the hours of service rules for trucking companies hauling qualified relief goods. Well, who's taking the risk on that? What I mean is that fatigue doesn't care whether it's a crisis or whether the skies are blue. Fatigue is fatigue. So it may be temporarily legal to drive 15 hours, but is it safe? And if a driver falls asleep and gets in an accident, I can tell you that when you're in litigation, nobody's going to care that it was legal. These are the examples where you've got to stay true to your values, even though it's tempting to compromise those values because of a crisis.
Who all is involved in the development of that plan? Is it a top-down thing? Do you pull in your department heads, or is it all hands on deck?
It's all the stakeholders. So generally for us, that would be your terminal manager, your maintenance group, your safety group. Those are the people who are there, boots on the ground, day to day, and their involvement, their input to what they see as their needs based on their operating conditions. You've got to get their input, their buy-in, and their participation. Very, very important with that. But then it is reviewed as we go up through our organizational structure by district managers and then upper management as well, to make sure that we're applying all the resources needed to have a successful plan.
You mentioned the annual review. Looking back at your Hurricane Michael preparedness plan with the benefit of hindsight, what are some of the things that you realized after the fact needed to be beefed up a little bit that maybe you weren't quite as prepared as you thought you might have been?
Looking back, I would tell you that the thing that we probably didn't consider as much as maybe we could have or should have was, as you bring people in from the outside, you've got to be able to support them, and that means you've got to have a place for them to stay. They have to have food, shelter, and all the things that would be needed if you were out on the road traveling, and those things just weren't available due to the damage to the whole area. Hotels, there was no access to get hotel rooms there in the Panama City area. You had to go much further out over to the west towards Pensacola before you could really start finding any availability of hotel rooms. But just as we were trying to look for those, so was everybody else. So it became very difficult to find that type of lodging that you would need to provide the resources for an outside team to come in and provide that help to the terminal. So that was a lesson learned for us.
How has that experience with the flood, or has it made the transition to this pandemic and dealing with some of the fallout from that, has that made it any easier?
That shared experience from 2019 is kind of continuing to have a positive effect on everybody's attitude, because we recognize that, some of these things that we take for granted, living on dry ground, they're really good things. And so, just having every day that we get is a good thing. It's not always going to be the greatest day. But, you can continue to have a good attitude about it and continue to help your fellow man. And, I think everybody comes out of that better if that's your goal.
You'd mentioned pausing capital projects. When that makes a lot of sense because the world's basically upside down right now. But how do you switch gears from a mentality that wants to drive growth into one that's really more fiscally conservative than you might otherwise like?
To some extent, the circumstances force it. Okay. But the better answer is that you need to have a disaster plan or a business continuity plan. And I guess because we live in a very active weather area, we had such a plan going into Harvey. We had the plan long before Harvey. We keep updating it. You know, the old saying, in case of emergency, break glass. You've got to have that plan to refer back to, because again, during a hurricane, when that hurricane is knocking on your doorstep, and with COVID, you don't always have the ability to think clearly. You certainly don't have the ability to get the committee together. So, you know, I know it might be a little bit late right now for people that don't have a plan, but it's not too late. Okay, the more you can lay down the process, what happens if something adverse happens? You know, what do we do? The better you can execute. Now, I don't think anybody could have fully planned for COVID. This is unprecedented. And so you've got to make decisions about your overhead. You've got to do whatever it takes for the business to survive. We put together our subject matter experts, including our frontline team members who'd been through this, to advise us. So putting a guiding coalition together is critical because you don't have all the answers. My opinion doesn't matter. What matters is the facts. What matters is the science. And the more that we can align our team around that, the better we can execute. But you don't have all the answers. Nobody does.
Property damage tends to create a lot of personal issues and concerns and distractions among the employees. And we sort of have that with COVID. So people are worrying about unemployment. They're worried about homeschooling. How do you manage those employees when their minds, understandably, are probably not necessarily on the task at hand?
Well, I think that for us, fortunately, we're able to see our drivers every day. They're reporting to that terminal, leaving from and returning to each day. So we actually have the ability to have that personal contact with our drivers as they're coming and going through the shift. That's not like everybody else. I can see it being more challenging if you were having to rely on other means of communication. But having that check, having that talk, how you doing? How's your family doing? Is there anything that we can help you with? It's just letting your employees know that you're there to help them through this to the extent that you can. Another thing that I feel is really a great resource is the employee assistance program through our HR group.
Your customers, either in a pandemic or a hurricane, they have a lot of the same problems that you're having. How do you continue to manage those relationships?
Well, in any type of disaster, your customers are a key component of your plan. And having some prior discussions with them as you go into each situation, we've been talking about hurricanes. So we start looking at our customer base and understanding from what we know in their day-to-day business, what we believe their needs are going to be to prioritize what locations are going to be in a hierarchy to be able to get product when they typically would need it, but also getting the customer's input just to have them as a partner participate in your plan for their input, and you can bring all that together with a operational plan on the front end to the extent that you think that's going to work, but it's a work in progress because you can never truly predict what the outcome, what's going to be on the other side. And so having the ability to be flexible with the changes that are going to happen is another important aspect of planning. And that's where having the various stakeholders engage and getting their input. We do that through a daily and sometimes twice a day conference call to be able to keep a close connection to what's happening out in the affected areas. And that input is constantly coming in, and we're adapting to the needs and the challenges that we're being confronted with.
Are there parts of your disaster preparedness plan or even your business continuity plan that came in particularly handy with your COVID response?
Yeah, I think with an example would be on the equipment side. With the virus, we had a couple of situations where we had one of our drivers that was in proximity to someone who had tested positive. So once we were made aware of that, we had that tractor placed out of service until we got that driver's update on their test, if they had been tested and what the results were, set up a protocol through HR for that to take place. And then based on the situation, we would actually engage a third party provider to come in and sanitize that tractor before it would be reassigned to another employee. So that kind of was part of a disaster plan as a whole, because you're assessing the condition of the equipment. Is it safe to operate? And even though we weren't sustaining physical damage to the equipment, there was other risk factors involved that had to be addressed before you could safely assign that truck to another person.
How do you keep your hands on your employees and keep pushing them forward with the right spirit?
Just build good relationships with people. Be good to people. People are very important, whether it's the guy who's sweeping the floor or the guy who's making the $10 million decision. Everybody's got a critical role.
Yep, and I agree with that. That's the biggest thing that I took away learning from my dad is, it's just the way that you treat people.
Josh, you'd mentioned not really having a business continuity plan specific to a flood because that had never happened before. And we're kind of in a similar situation here. This has never happened before. So post-flood, were you able to integrate maybe a flood response into a business continuity plan? And has any of that been helpful as you try to navigate your way through the coronavirus?
We did have a business continuity plan for this year in case of another flood. We set up another building. And we had a really good plan in the case it flooded again. That's not what happened this year. It was a pandemic.
Yeah.
But we had considered some other things. We were able to more easily transition people to working from home than we would have prior to the flood. We did make some decisions, post 2019 flood that made dealing with this quite a little bit easier.
You'd mentioned a business continuity plan and all the other strategies that kind of help move an operation through times like these. You've been through Hurricane Ike, you've been through Hurricane Harvey, so I imagine Jetco's business continuity plan includes a lot of content on property damage and floods, but that's not really the reality of what we're currently dealing with. So what from your continuity plan were you able to use in your COVID response?
What we learned in Harvey quite quickly is that our employees were more than capable of working remotely. They did a great job because we had a plan in place to basically shift our phones, computers, everything remotely, and it worked. So we were able to kind of pick up on that playbook and use that to make sure that we were working remotely. Now, look, I had no idea going into COVID-19 that we're going to be working remotely as long as I think we're going to. But the point is, we really haven't missed a beat. And the fact that we're able to do this so well comes out of the learning in Harvey on how to work remotely. And that's all documented in the business continuity plan, making sure our IT is in the cloud so that there's no issue if there would be a problem at the physical building. All of those things came into play. Employee assistance plans, same thing, came into play. So there were parts of the plan that were applicable to COVID-19. Then there were parts, for example, again, flooding out that aren't applicable, although I will point out hurricane season is right around the corner. And then there's things that we've learned in COVID that we never would have thought of before, like distancing and all the enhanced hygiene measures that we're taking. So we're getting smarter in a whole new area because of COVID that we weren't with Harvey. So it's iterative. You keep building on. Every challenge leads to new learnings.
We've got the benefit of about 3 months of experience dealing with this pandemic. When you reevaluate your business continuity plan this month, are you going to add anything specific about dealing with circumstances like these?
Yeah, we did have pandemics as part of our overall business continuity plan. But we never could have, I don't think anyone really could have imagined that we would be faced with the situation that we've had to work through. But having that as a reference, a baseline to work from, helped us have the fundamental structure in place as this thing started to ramp up. Again, going back to having those conference calls, and we are continuing to do that throughout the virus here to monitor the situation. That was a really good thing for us to already have in place, and people that have participated in that through other components of the business continuity plan. That really was helpful for us to manage through this with as least disruption as possible.
You mentioned the plan included a pandemic component, but now you've actually been through one. Are there a couple of things you look back on and say, when we reevaluate this plan, we're adding this?
I think it was really the main difference with this versus what we, looking in the crystal ball, thought a pandemic may play out to was the extended nature of disruption. Typically the things that you would have in a hurricane or more of a shorter duration than what we've experienced here with the pandemic. So that's probably the one thing that we would put more thought into going forward, is having extended disruption to the normal business operation.
Is your business continuity plan sort of a living document where you may integrate some of the pandemic response into it now that we've been through one and you see what one can look like?
Exactly. Yep. I know it seems reactionary, but, like we said before, how do you plan for some of this stuff? And this is going to help our flood plan too. We've got people that have been working from home. We've made some adjustments. We've had some good ideas from employees. Whatever happens next, I think we're going to be that much more versatile.
You had mentioned it would help your flood plan. Is that mostly the component for the remote work?
Our team understands how to get through stuff like this. We haven't had a single employee complain, including our driver fleet. They've been great. Most of those guys have been through that last year. Nobody complained last year either. Everybody just did the work. We discovered something with these people working from home that they've done a good job. It can be done. We can run, almost as efficiently with everybody working from home. So we feel pretty good about that. We're going to coming out of this pandemic.
What does your business continuity plan look like now that you have some experience navigating a pandemic? What does that plan include now that maybe wasn't there 4 months ago?
We've gotten a lot smarter with Teams and Zoom and working remotely. And I think that goes beyond business continuity also, because this is going to create, and I see it ushering a whole new wave of people who can work from home. I think a lot of the things that we learned in the business continuity plan that we never would have thought of before COVID it all comes down to hygiene. We're not coming back to work all at once so fast. I don't care what the executive orders say. I don't care what the government regulations say, because the risk of being wrong is just too great. So you bring everybody back, one person gets sick, now your entire office is quarantined. On top of that, you've exposed your entire office. So what we've learned, I think, through COVID is not to rush it the way some states are rushing it right now. We're going to be gradual. We're going to get back to normal. It's not going to be overnight, because we understand that we're all learning, including the experts. We're all going through a major learning curve here.
Thanks, guys. That was a lot of really good information there. I think my biggest takeaway might have been that Mike Tyson might have been right. Everybody does have a plan until you get punched in the mouth.